Chapter 4. Athlon arrives in Sabernac, sees the restaurant. After a couple of hours of driving, and by a couple, I don't mean precisely two. Yes, I know that a couple in human relationship terms indicates a pair of people in an ongoing romance, but I refuse to be limited in such a way. By the way, isn't it interesting how you never say a pair of hours? Athlon entered the little town of Sabernac, just over the border in Georgia. I think I'll eat lunch here, he thought, and began looking out for a promising restaurant, one that was locally owned and not part of a chain. He soon came to the town square. On one side was the courthouse. In the middle was a monument to some Confederate military leader. There were several restaurants among the stores that lined the square, but the one that attracted his attention was called the Dockside Grill. Now, at this point, I could just have Athlon get out of his car, eat his food, and be on his way. But if I was, and let me take a moment to explain that if I was is grammatically correct, not if I were. Putting the word if at the beginning of a phrase doesn't change its tense. To do that, I might as well tell you that after that, Athlon eventually arrived at the prefectural, and our story is now concluded. However, this is a novel, with certain requirements incumbent upon that designation, chief of which is a minimum word count. It is my responsibility as a novelist to pad this thing out, giving you, the reader, that's consumer for you Republicans, a greater literary experience than that to be had in a short story or a mere outline of the doings of these characters. I suppose I could abandon my initial plan and just write until I felt that I had said all that needed to be said, but it is precisely my plan that is enabling me to write this novel in the first place. Without the plan, I'd probably wind up with nothing more than a wandering abstraction. Not that there would be anything wrong with a wandering abstraction, now that I think about it, but what I ask you would be the point of my writing a novel if it isn't really a novel. My whole impetus here is to write a novel, not tell a story, per se. I don't really have anything to say. I don't really have some burning desire to impart my philosophy to you. It's just that I do have a modicum of writing ability and feel that it would be a waste not to put it to use. I've written hundreds of short stories, and now I want to write a real novel, a lengthy narrative. I suppose I could just be content sitting on my fat American ass and watching whatever pablum the computerized TV spits out, but I'm far too obdurate and contrary for that. But what about poetry, you ask? Couldn't you be contented writing poetry? Well, I'm sorry, I've lost the thread of what I was saying. It was Athlon's decision to take on the time-killing task of retying his shoes that spared me from having to find more things to say. He parked his car in one of the conveniently slanted spaces. Don't you hate those straight, hard-to-get in and out of parking spaces? Against the tiny sward surrounding the monument, and to hell with this. From now on, I'm not gonna force it. I'll follow my plan, tell you what happens, but if I can't fill up the requisite space with the story, I'll just ramble about nothing. Okay? Do you think you can live with that? I'm going to finish this book no matter what. So, let's see. I am currently sitting in the break room at my place of employment waiting to go home. I'm in what used to be the smoking room, a room within the break room, which was once the only place you were allowed to smoke in the building. Now smoking is banned everywhere on the property, although people still smoke out in the parking lot. This is the only place where I can feel relatively isolated from the TV. Athlon stops at a store on the way to the restaurant. Heading towards the Dockside Grill, Athlon spied a store called The Charged Implement. It looked fairly interesting, and, as he was trying to adopt a carefree attitude, one which would lead him to wander aimlessly into just such a store when in fact his destination, his purpose, had been to go straight to the fulfillment of his lunch duties, he stepped inside. He was immediately enveloped by the conglomeration of aromas typical of such gift shops: scented candles, handcrafted soaps, and old-fashioned candy. The floors were wood. They creaked under his feet as he passed among the wares. Looking up, Athlon noticed the ceiling was stamped tin. He grimaced. Stamped tin frightened him. For some reason, he had had a series of dreams in which whole houses, whole neighborhoods had been made out of this stuff. I could probably do a whole story just on these dreams. Athlon had no idea where exactly this phobia, not just of stamped tin, but of old neighborhoods, nightmarishly depopulated, found its origin, probably from visiting his grandmother as a small child. He shook his head and creaked further into the store. Most of the items appeared to be the usual souvenirs and novelty products that every local color store owner orders from the same half-dozen catalogs that all of their fellows order from. What Athens scanned for were the things one could only get at this particular store in this particular town. Apparently the local university sports mascot was the eagle. There were several kitschy things, either hand-painted with the team's colors or logo, or somewhat cleverly rendered eaglish by the application of a woodsman's anti-boredom skills. Athlon was on the verge of reluctantly purchasing one of these depressing examples of craft when he spied a rack holding several apparently handmade puppets. He examined one closely. The tag not only bore no barcode, but it had been lettered by a human hand with a felt-tip marker. "Excuse me," he interrupted the two middle-aged women behind the counter. "Are these made by a local artist?" "Yes, sir, they are," replied one of the women, the one whose hair was kept resolutely dyed raven black. "Michelle Caramba makes those by hand. Aren't they wonderful?" "Yes, they are," Athlon agreed, his eyes gazing into those of the puppet in his hands. "She models them on real people in the Sabernac area," the woman continued. That explains why they're so ugly, Athlon thought, though in truth he felt that they were in the ugly but beautiful category. He returned to the rack to make sure the one he held was really the one he wanted. However, while scanning its brethren, the already chosen puppet grew warm to him. He turned his face to him and said hello in a silly voice. This amused the shopkeepers, he was sure, but did not look at them to verify this. He went to the counter and said, "I'll take this one." "All right," the woman replied enthusiastically, although I didn't feel her enthusiasm merited an exclamation point. "You know," the woman told him as she took his money, $65, "the name of the person who the puppet is based on is written on the tag." Athlon turned the tag over. Gober Myrtlesby it read. Well, that would have to change. How about Freddie, he thought. "We'll discuss it in the car," he telepathically told the puppet. Are you from out of town?" "Yes," Athlon answered. "Would you like to sign our guest book?" the other woman, proudly gray, asked. "Reg Pesto," Athlon signed, followed by a wholly fictitious address. Athlon goes into the restaurant and orders. His new friend in a paper sack, Athlon exited the store and continued down the sidewalk to the Dockside Grill. Why it was called the Dockside Grill was a mystery, one he did not intend to unravel by the expedient of asking. He would arrive at a satisfactory answer through wholly deductive means. After all, they were nearly 300 miles from the ocean, and no other significant body of water lay anywhere near the little town of Sabernac. The reason might be something as disappointing as a joke. The idea that one of the locals might think he had a sense of humor was a depressing one. "Good afternoon," a young woman in a maroon apron greeted him. "Just one?" "Yes." "Booth okay?" She was already leading him to one under a rather large model of a boat mounted on the wall. "Well, if it falls on my head, I'll own the place," Athlon thought. What would you like to drink?" the waitress, whose name was Johnny, as indicated on her name tag, asked. "Do you have a list of beers you offer?" "Foolish question. The town's dry." Johnny made an apologetic face. Did she suspect just how lame her town was? Sorry. Athlon sighed in resignation, as we all do. "Do you have Coca-Cola?" "Oh, yeah." "All right, I'll have a Coke." Athlon smiled. He hadn't had a Coke in years. It had been even longer since he'd had a Pepsi, but he wasn't willing to be quite that indifferent yet. While Johnny was gone to fulfill his request, Athlon looked about for clues to the restaurant's name. Obviously, there was a nautical theme to the place, with models of boats and pictures of boats and life preservers all over. But these evolved from the name. They were not its inspiration. If only he could spot the owner. The waitresses were all young, pretty girls of the same caste as Johnny. The only man in evidence was a dark-skinned fellow glimpsed occasionally behind the grill, but he was too young to be the owner. He looked like he intended to be there just long enough to get the means to get the hell out. "Would you like to hear our lunch specials?" Johnny asked. She placed his drink in an unopened straw on the table. Sure," Athlon replied as he picked up the laminated menu from its place between the ketchup bottle and the rather sticky-looking bottle of malt vinegar. "We have a tilapia sandwich that comes with coleslaw and fries. That's $6.99. We have a grouper sandwich that also comes with coleslaw and fries. That's $7.99. We have..." "That sounds good." Athlon pointed at Johnny, cutting her off. "I'll have the grouper sandwich." "Okay," Johnny smiled. After she left, Athlon noted happily that the only music in the place was a murmur coming from a radio in the kitchen. That and the muffled sound of a television tuned to some sports channel provided a pleasantly busy but unobtrusive background noise. As he waited, Athlon began to speculate. Perhaps the owner was a frustrated sailor, condemned to a life on land because of some neurosis. Perhaps a better name for the place would be the Dry Dock Grill. The logo could be a drawing of a fish gasping for breath on a kitchen table. They could put it on T-shirts. The waitress's thoughts are seen. Johnny had recently had a dream in which he was making love to another girl. She didn't find it all that disturbing, nor did she wonder whether she might be a lesbian at heart. The thought of naked Mark Wahlberg still filled her with desire. Change the name to whatever celebrity is relevant to the times in which you read this, or to your own life experience. For example, Cary Grant will do just as suitably as Sean Cassidy. However, pondering the dream did raise certain questions. Primary among these was the question of whether she should try lesbian sex. Quickly following on this was the question of whom the other woman in the dream was. She had long black hair. Johnny remembered that. There was something about her that made Johnny think it was someone she knew. She shook her head. It would come to her, and when it did, she would know what to do. Now let us enter the theater of Johnny's mind. As we take our seats, you will notice that there are no emergency exits. In case of fire, or if you feel like throwing up, you will have to leave the way we came in, through the surprisingly dirty ear canal. One would think that a girl so dedicated to the trimming and painting of her toenails would have a care for the condition of her ears. One day some boy will reject her, and she will never know that it was her ears, as well as her toes, that motivated him. I am sorry that the concession stand was out of popcorn. I have some traditional movie candy in my pocket if you'd like some. Now settle back and wait for the show to begin. I'll tell you now that it won't be a feature, but a collection of short subjects. Johnny doesn't have a great overarching theme to her life or her thinking. If she did, it could possibly be titled, If Only I Had a Straight Nose and Bigger Tits. The first things we see on the screen, and take a look around you before the lights go down completely, this is one of the last of the great movie palaces, is a sunburned, weather-worn man in a cap bearing the Eagle mascot. He is driving a tractor over soil the color of oxidized blood. From this soil will come snubby spears of sorghum, illustrated by animated sprouts pushing their sleepy, smiling heads above the surface of the earth. The man on the tractor spits a stream of tobacco juice onto one of these little heads, symbolizing his unwitting contempt for all life. The next scene is set in the hallway of the local high school. You can almost smell the right guard and polo cologne as the surge of ugly, fat-faced youths pushes through the hallway's cinder-block confines. How many times have those walls been repainted? One for every year spent among the penitentiary lockers that line them, says the off-camera voice of Tom Waits, although he is not identified as such and would not be recognized by the participants even if he was. We focus on a small group of students gathered before a fire extinguisher just under a framed picture of some administrator. We focus on a small group of students gathered before a fire extinguisher just under a framed picture of some administrator geriatric in their parents' time. The baby shows signs of abuse, one of the girls says. The final scene is a clearing in the woods. Two people, a man and a woman, each young and slender, emerged from the capped bed of a truck parked in the center of the clearing. That they are hippies of some kind is betrayed by their casual attitude towards nudity. After all, aren't they being filmed? Don't they know that people are going to see this and know exactly what their bodies look like? Well, of course, it's not a big problem for them. They are, as I said, young and slender. It's a treat to flaunt their flawlessness. Hell, if I was thin and muscular, I'd probably go around naked too. Plus, being thin makes your dick look bigger. The cook makes the food. Chris, the cook, had only been working at the Dockside Grill about 3 months. He was saving up to get his van's engine rebuilt. The plan was to return to Chicago once that was done. To that end, he was wary of forming any attachments in the meantime. He worked, ran several miles a day, and returned to the apartment he shared with another man, where he played video games and slept. As he prepared Athlen's grouper sandwich, he reflected on how his family had moved from the South many years ago. "Be sure to catch some mullet while you're down there," his aunt had told him before he left on his journey of self-discovery. The idea had been to gather material for a book of some kind, but all Chris could think of writing now was a treatise on why I hate fish. He glanced at Johnny and the other girl on duty, Kimberly. Thank God this wasn't the old days. He could be lynched just for looking at a white girl. Not that he would ever touch any of these redneck pinheads. Such ill-considered, if considered at all, pride and rural ignorance. Still, he did his best to be funny and friendly. He was determined to display a positive image, not of being black so much as of being from Chicago, a place viewed even today with some suspicion and contempt, even as racial suspicion and contempt had largely diminished to a trace of stink in the air, like the smell of fried fish in a room long quitted of its consumer. His roommate was another black man named Jamarcus. His highest ambition was to become a preacher. His time was spent lackadaisically working his way through a series of workbooks and lessons obtained from some highly dubious source. The program's logo, imprinted on these materials, showed a cross embraced by a crudely drawn serpent. What denomination this represented was a mystery to Chris. He avoided engaging in religious discussions with anyone. Although he found Jamarcus amiable enough as a roommate, he knew that he wouldn't miss the man when he had finally quit this town. Still, he thought as he arranged the sandwich on a platter, Jamarcus would make a good character in a story. His name was a portmanteau of Jim and Marcus. He was named, as he explained to Chris on several occasions, after two uncles. Why he never remembered that he had already imparted this information was simply because he was an idiot. An amiable idiot, but an idiot nonetheless. Perhaps I might get a book out of this trip after all, Chris's mind continued to work. For example, Jamarcus's three brothers were all in jail for various offenses, some homicidal in nature. Another thing that Jamarcus had told him repeatedly was the story of coming home to find his youngest brother passed out on the floor, an empty bottle of Seagram 7 beside him, Jamarcus's copy of What's Going On playing on the stereo. At least he was listening to good music, Jamarcus guffawed. Chris made a wry face as he scooped out a helping of coleslaw. Clearly anything he wrote about the people in Sabernac would be flavored with an unpalatable measure of contempt. In order to get around that, he'd have to dilute everything with humor. But if I could be humorous, I'd be a comedian, not a grill cook, he mumbled aloud. What? Johnny, overhearing him, asked. Nothing, Chris said. Order up. Mercy, mercy me, began playing on the radio. A local couple speculate. I think he's gay, Strickland Bronson whispered to his wife. The two senior citizens sat near the back of the dockside grill where they could watch everyone who came in and everyone who passed by. The focus of their attentions was Athlon. There is something gay about him, Bronson's wife Gregoria admitted, but her tone indicated that she wasn't yet convinced of the conclusion. She looked intently into the napkin dispenser as Athlon glanced their way. Whatever he is, she continued, he's got money. That car? Gregoria nodded. Where do you think he's from? Bronson shoveled up a mouthful of the little crunchy things that lay around a piece of deep-fried flounder like Lilliputians wondering what to do about Gulliver. Gregoria considered. She studied Athlon's pile of white hair, his jowly head, his expensive-looking clothes, his watch. I don't know, she drawled. Look at that watch. Bronson squinted. I can't really make it out. Where are your glasses? Her tone was admonitory. I left them at home. He took a sip of iced tea. I didn't think I'd need them, he added in response to his wife's look of reproach. You're driving all the way here, and you didn't notice I didn't have my glasses on? He tried to summon up the same level of admonition, of reproach, as his wife, but he had always been emotionally lazy. Well, not always, but since the onset of adulthood, he had just found it easier to remain calm. Some might say indifferent, but that is being unfair. I wasn't looking at you, I was watching the road, but I'm the one who's driving. Not on the way home, you're not. Someone has to watch the road. Bronson nodded in sardonic acquiescence. That was fine with him. He hated to drive. Let her hit every pothole on the way home. What watching the road meant to her was a mystery, for she certainly didn't notice the potholes. He slumped in his chair and glanced at the stranger. How is everything? Johnny asked as she approached their table. Very good as usual, Johnny, Gregoria replied. Bronson sat up and motioned with his head to the waitress, indicating the desire for conspiratorial closeness. Tell me, he said, where's that guy from? Johnny's eyes darted towards the front. I don't know, she said. Not from around here. Did you happen to see what car he's driving? No, sorry. You know? I bet he's from Florida, Gregoria suggested with certainty. What makes you say that? Her husband asked. The waitress examined the couple's plates. She noticed that neither had finished their scallops. She wondered if there was something wrong with them. Excuse me, she interrupted the ongoing speculations. Was there something wrong with the scallops? Strickland Bronson looked up at Johnny. His mouth showed distaste. Athlon peruses the local paper. After ordering, Athlon had excused himself to get a newspaper from a machine outside. Now he sat methodically going through the paper, learning what he could about Sabernac and the surrounding county of Goriculum. The paper was a weekly. Unfortunately, the issue that Athlon read was already 6 days old. The headline referred to a national happening that had taken place nearly 2 weeks before. The photo on the front page, however, was a grainy black and white picture of a local high school athlete in the midst of some exciting play on the ball field. Athlon learned that the boy's name was Grover. He wondered if he was related to any of the other Grovers whose names were sprinkled here and there throughout the 16 pages of newsprint. One, for example, was Lydia Grover, whose byline topped a column titled Cerealia Community, detailing the week's social activities of the residents of that local unincorporated region of the county. Athlon was particularly amused at the news that the sisters Tiama and Juanita Franklin had recently taken a day trip to Slorksville in neighboring Grampus County to visit the ailing Mrs. Creams, widow of the late Sergeant Bob Creams. Included with a single section that comprised the newspaper proper, the Sabernac Immutable, was a sales flyer for a local grocery store called Mel's. Headache powders and white dirt were advertised along with green beans and ham hocks. A cartoon illustration of the store's founder, Mel himself, depicted the man in the apron shouting out "Yee-haw!" in manic glee. Athlon found the letters to the editor to be the most entertaining part of the paper. One of these, from a woman named Jean Brolo, made the argument that there would be far fewer married couples getting divorced because of sexual incompatibility if single people weren't so promiscuous. That way, she reasoned, one wouldn't know what great sex was in the first place and therefore wouldn't be dissatisfied with its absence in one's marriage. Another, this one from a man named Wilson Crabbler, claimed that there couldn't be life on other planets because if there was, God would have told us so in the Bible. A third letter, written by a 13-year-old girl, expressed gratitude on behalf of the Wilkes family to everyone who contributed to Becky's brain tumor surgery. Who contributed money for Becky's brain tumor surgery. Contrary to rumor, the funds were not spent on cocaine and pot. Athlon noted that the two big-name editorial columnists were both notorious right-wingers. Not the most famous one, of course, the paper couldn't afford them, but second-tier writers popular with the veterans and churchgoers in the area. There was also an editorial by the paper staff endorsing the continuation of the special local option sales tax, seeing as how the high school gymnasium still wasn't as good as those in the neighboring counties. The ads were interesting too. Apparently tree stumps were a problem in Curriculum County. At least 6 businesses specialized in stump grinding and removal at least 6 businesses specializing in stump grinding and removal solicited custom in the pages of the Immutable. There were also several local businesses that would not only process the deer carcass for you, but store the meat should you not have sufficient freezer space at home. If Athlon had wanted either a chainsaw to create stumps with or a rifle with which to kill deer, both were abundantly available through the classifieds. Pleased as he was to see that Mrs. Roberta Clamage had safely returned from her visit to see her new granddaughter in Alabama, Athlon put the paper aside when his food arrived. And eats. Athlon's meal, consisting of a grilled slab of grouper on a steamed hoagie roll, a helping with coleslaw, an order of french fries, and a Coca-Cola, was placed before him. Johnny wished him bon appetit in her native tongue and left him to it. Athlon lifted the top piece of bread on his sandwich and discovered that his piece of fish was accompanied by a layer of lettuce and a smear of mayonnaise. There was also a slice of dill pickle in the middle of the arrangement. He removed this. One of my grandmother's favorite stories about me as a child was at the time we were eating at Burger King. I must have been about 3 years old. It wasn't enough that I removed the pickle, which I hated, from my hamburger. I also had to remove it from hers when she opened it up to add ketchup. I flung it on the floor. So I can sympathize in a way with Athlon's decision. Another funny story about me at the dinner table as a time we had a family meal at my aunt's house. I was sitting next to her. On the platter in the middle of the table was one last biscuit. When she reached for it and put it on her plate, I said to her, "You hog." But these are stories about me. You want to read more about Athlon's lunch. The problem, however, is that there is only so much I can say about a man steadily making his way through a sandwich platter. Athlon found the sandwich satisfactory, not exceptional. The fries were too salty, but he didn't complain. Actually, they were as salty as he'd expected them to be. The coleslaw was exactly as it should be, which made him think that it must have been manufactured by a restaurant supply company and bought in bulk. The first episode of Coca-Cola was good, but nauseating thereafter. How did these rednecks drink gallons of it each week? Athlon recalled a fish sandwich he had at Nob Grimaldi's house several years before. Grimaldi, a fellow writer, lived on a cliff overlooking the ocean, so it was not surprising that seafood comprised a large portion of his diet. "I fished right off the side of the cliff," he explained to his guests as they stood drinking liquor on a platform bolted to the ancient rock face. Athlon had looked over the edge and thought about how easily one might dispose of a dead body from such a vantage. Of course, as Grimaldi had written several mysteries and political thrillers in his career, the thought had probably occurred to him as well. As they sat down to eat, Athlon wondered whether their food had been caught by their host. Hard to believe that a fishing line could reach for that far down. "How's your new book coming?" Grimaldi asked Athlon during a moment when the two were alone. Athlon passed his hand over his face. His hair had been stark white since he was 30 years old. "Not well," he admitted. "As you know, I've always had trouble with characters, seeing them all as extensions of myself." "Do what I do," Grimaldi smiled dismissively. "Just think of your book as a movie. It's only entertainment after all." Athlon shook his head. His brow was sweaty. I'm serious, Grimaldi continued. Culture is nothing more than the sum total of our entertainments, which are themselves nothing but a means of staving off boredom once we've solved the problem of food and shelter. Athlon wanted desperately to respond, to deny his friend's assertion, but he was now too busy vomiting. Outside, a malcontent. Oblivious to the wealthy novelist sitting inside the dockside grill, but fully aware of the expensive car parked in the square, a young man in battered black jeans, threadbare sneakers, and a t-shirt bearing the name and license imagery of a marginally well-known metal band sat on the edge of one of the concrete planters that abutted the sidewalk. His name was Dennis Costardo, although he longed to change it because of the ease with which others could render it retardo. In his current fantasies, he became Del Monte, member of a metal band as equally marginal and insultingly abrasive as Jack Proviso, the one his shirt pledged allegiance to. Snot Silo, he thought. That'd be a good name. This was a game he played on a daily basis, thinking of good names for the band he wanted to assemble. Nobody in this shit town wants to do it, though, he complained to himself once again. All they care about is that fucking country music, Dennis scowled. If only I could move to California. By some miracle of doubly twisted obstinacy, Dennis did not smoke. He was 19 years old. Although not old enough to drink legally, he yet could drink if he wanted to, so prevalent was alcohol. However, he did not drink either, out of loyalty to a vaguely understood credo imported from the metropolises to the north. Straight edge, they called it, but Dennis did not. He refused to align himself formally with the movement. He didn't skate, and he didn't like the music that came out of the straight edge. In fact, he was seriously considering becoming a consumer of psychedelics should he ever make it to California and put together his ideal band. Hell, I don't know what I want, he admitted, but only deep down in some metaphorical seat of the emotions, where even he could barely hear himself confess such a thing. If Dennis had known about the relative success that a former classmate of his was now enjoying, it would have driven him to throw a brick through every window downtown. A fellow alumni of Curriculum County High School, Tommy Raddington, had moved away to attend university. His avowed intention had been to study business, but he had somehow fallen in with a band that needed a singer. They were now touring Canada in an old school bus. It wasn't heavy metal, but it was distinctive, intense music, outside the parameters of anything that would ever be heard on a mainstream radio or television. It was bad enough that Dennis's parents were even now arranging for him to work at the post office. If you're not going to go to school, you have to have a job, his mother, born into poverty and only freed of it by a combination of thrift and incessant anxiety, insisted. Go to school. What a joke. His attempt at higher education had been a colossal failure. Following the example of another classmate, Dennis had tried studying to be a respiratory therapist at the local technical college, but his natural inclination after 12 years of sloth and repression had been to revel in the lifting of the repression by taking the sloth to the extreme. He preferred hanging out with losers 2 and 3 years younger than himself to any application to study. Maybe I'll hitchhike across the country, he mused, as he snuffed out the lives of several ants crawling about on the planter. Maybe I'll just start walking, he thought further, realizing he was afraid to put his thumb out. Damn this town, he concluded. Athlon pays his check and drives away. The last fry on Athlon's plate had been eaten only 60 seconds before Johnny brought him his check. How was everything, she asked, laying the handwritten bill on the table. It was very good, Athlon exaggerated. Good, I'll take this whenever you're ready. Johnny patted the check as if it was the head of a child you're never going to see again. Athlon looked at the total after the waitress walked away. He calculated the tip by determining what 10% was, having that, and then adding it back to the 10%. He then added the tip to the bill and rounded the whole thing off. This amount he left on the table in cash. He took one last look around and exited. As he got to the door, he heard Johnny call out, "Thank you, have a nice day." He turned his head slightly in her direction as he pushed on the door and smiled only with the side of his mouth facing the waitress. He said nothing. As he walked to his car, he wondered what the people in the dockside grill, customers and staff, had thought about him. Did they imagine him to be a big real estate developer come to size up the town, a scout for the football program of some far-off university, a strangely effete private investigator? He chuckled at that last image. He should pretend to be a detective one day. Just go to some little town and start asking questions about somebody who had supposedly lived there 10 years before. Maybe he could pose as a reporter doing a story on the unique architecture somewhere. That would get him into people's houses. In the car, he took up his puppet out of the paper sack. He put it on his hand and examined it. You look more like a Tom? Winston? Graphiticus? Dopey? Ornette? He liked the sound of Ornette, but realized how foolish he would feel saying Ornette aloud. Let's go with Phil, okay? Whatever you say, Phil replied, his voice only slightly different from Athlon's, a little more pinched and nasal. Good. Athlon took off the puppet and propped him up in the passenger seat as best he could, given that the puppet had nothing to support its head. Thank you. Athlon left town in a northwesterly direction. He was surprised to see just how far the town extended on this side of the square. There were many old houses along the straight road. Eventually, however, these petered out, and he was driving through an ugly section dominated by crappy supermarket chains like Ingles and lubrication franchises and fast food restaurants. As they drove away, Athlon told Phil what they were doing and where they were going. We're going to the prefectural in Watkins, far to the north, but on the way we're going to stop in at my cousin's house just over the border in Alabama. I haven't seen him in a while, and I'm bringing him a present. Eventually the puppet took on the persona of a journalist interviewing Athlon. I'm having trouble with my new novel, Athlon explained. I've been having trouble figuring out exactly what it is that I want to do, but I think I'm beginning to understand what really pleases me aesthetically, ideally. He paused to adjust his glasses, push his hair out of his face. What I want, and this applies, I think, to my taste in music, film, what have you, is to have a little bit of something that makes sense, but taken out of context, followed by nonsense, chaos, then back to the story.